get right to it. The workshop on Brexit and industry and space policy. Welcome to all participants. This is the third in a series of workshops on the impact of Brexit on the EU 27. And we have a final workshop on Brexit and Horizon Europe taking place in November. The EU's industrial policy aims to make European industry more competitive so it can maintain its role as a driver of sustainable growth and employment in Europe. Micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises constitute 99% of companies in the EU, providing 2/3 of private sector jobs and contributing to more than half of the total added value created by businesses in EU. A strong EU space policy can benefit scientific research, but also EU economy at large, particularly in sectors such as transport and climate, as well as communication and security. And with less than half a year until Brexit, today's workshop will explore the potential legal and economic impacts on the EU 27 of Brexit and industry and space policy. It's inevitable that the UK withdrawal will have some form of impact. We have an hour for this workshop, a little less than an hour, I have to say, since we will be voting at 4 o'clock. The workshop will be web streamed. Presentations will be published on the ITRA committee website. A summary report will be made available on the website. Speakers will have maximum 10 minutes per presentation. And after the presentation from these three speakers, there'll be a question and answer session. So, with these words, I'm happy to give the floor to the first speaker, Reinhilde Veugelers. Is that perfect? Thank you. Giving an overview of the potential implications of Brexit for the EU 27 industry and space policy. Mrs. Veugelers is a full professor at Leuven in the Department of Management, Strategy and Innovation. She's been a senior fellow at Bruegel since 2009, a CEPR research fellow and a member of the Royal Flemish Academy of Belgium for Sciences. And currently serving on the ERC Scientific Council, being a member of the Research, Innovation, Science Policy Experts High-Level Group advising Commissioner Carlos Moedas. Please, Mrs. Veugelers, the floor is yours.
Yep. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk about industry and space policy and how that would look like after the Brexit. But first caveat, which I guess most of the events on Brexit always start with, is the whole uncertainty about Brexit and how the trade relationships and integration with between the UK and EU 27 will look like, together with also the whole uncertainty on how after Brexit what kind of industrial and space strategy the UK will develop, of course, make it very difficult also at this stage for the EU to think about how its industrial and space policy should and would look like after Brexit here. So at this stage, with all this uncertainty evolving, at this stage, we can only flag some general principles of how the EU 27 industrial and space policy response would actually look like here. And that's what I'll try to do here. So my presentation will be a very broad overview of the principles of such an industrial and space policy. And my two other presenters today will go much more in the details of industry policy and of space policy here. So what I would like to do is very briefly sketch a bit what the changing environment is of business, and then what the impact is of that, understanding that changing environment better in order to see what needed policies we would actually have within the EU 27 for Europe's growth. So what kind of industrial and space policy would we need? And then try to assess a bit what the impact is of Brexit for that needed industrial policy here. So in terms of challenging and changing environment here, I think you mostly are familiar with all of these here. So it's the rising globalization, and particularly the rise of Asia and of China, together with a rapid technological change, with especially digital technologies evolving very fast. And as a consequence, also a lot of blurring of sector boundaries here. For instance, servitization of manufacturing. So it's much more difficult now to draw clear lines between sectors. And related to this blurring of sector boundaries is the blurring of firm boundaries here, with particularly firms much more connected through global value chains. And then also, I think a very important part of the environment for business is the exposure to much more uncertainty. That can be economic uncertainty, but also increasingly political uncertainty here with the rise of protectionism, trade wars, and Brexit is one of those uncertainty elements here, but not the only one. So also much more uncertainty with respect to government policy in general. I would like to go in detail into what I think is really a very important driver of many of the changes we will be discussing, and that's this trend towards global value chains, and related to that, the importance of innovative capacity here. So what we see is, we've done some research on that within Bruegel to illustrate that more with hard data, is that the economic activities in the EU have become much more integrated within global value chains, where firms and also countries and regions increasingly specialize not on the whole value chain, but on specific tasks and stages within a value chain. And that means that there is much more connectedness between firms, between sectors, and between regions and countries here. For Europe in particular, what we've also seen in the data is that although we usually use the term global value chains, for European firms there's definitely a European dimension here, where most of the time these value chains are really organized at the European level, so we could really talk about European value chains. And what we see is that firms that participate in these global value chains, and these are not just only the big firms that sit on top of these value chains, but also SMEs, small firms that service and supply to these value chains, can actually build much more effectively sustainable competitive positions, will be more productive, so they can actually create much more value. And to the extent that their contribution is really based on unique skills and competences, they can also capture much more of that value when they are aligned in these European value chains. And that immediately ties global value chains also with innovative capacity here, because increasingly we will be relying on firms and sectors to contribute to EU economy, not so much about depending on the quantity of what they produce, but much more on the quality of what they're producing. So their contribution really will come through contributing with productivity growth and high value-added types of activities, which actually very often are associated with innovative capacity here. And that's something we see across all sectors here, so the contribution really coming from high value-added activities, which very often and typically rely on innovative capacities of firms that design these capacities and activities within global value chains, and particularly for European firms, European value chains. So what impact would that have for designing policy here? So, of course, it's important to recognize this interconnectedness of activities across firms and across sectors and across countries here, and really also will have its implications on how we should design policies here. For countries, that means it really needs to be able to not just have these global value chains, but also be able to benefit from global value chains. So that means, in first instance, of course, you need these value chains to be able to operate, so cross-border flows of capital, labor, human capital, and knowledge. Is important, but it's also important to be able to capture the value from that. So that means that for countries, they would also need to link this to really productive capabilities in tasks that they can specialize on within these global value chains. So you need very fluid global value chains, but then countries can capture the value from that, from really specializing and embedding local productive capabilities of certain tasks within the value chain. That means then for the policy agenda that, of course, it's a will always be a combination both of border policies, of trade policies, in order to ensure the well-functioning of these value chains. But the capturing value part for the policy perspective is a behind-the-border policy that allows firms to participate in these value chains and capture the value from that. So that's the combination of trade policy and behind-the-border policy, and that links industrial policy intrinsically to trade policy here. So openness is a necessary condition for firms to be able to integrate in international production networks, but these industrial policies will be very important to capture the value behind the border of these value chains here. So that, of course, means that, first of all, very importantly, for being able to capture value from these European value chains is trade policy here. And in view of the magnification effect of tariffs and non-tariff barriers along the value chain, any trade barrier that would arise somewhere in the value chain will have an effect on all the firms that are much closer connected here. So that means really going for open markets and elimination of tariff and non-tariff barriers along the whole value chain. And of course, that means that all the components in the value chain need to be sufficiently open, but that also means that we really have to think broader in terms of the trade partners here, because any barrier with a third country that is also upward or downward connected in the value chain will have an impact on all the firms involved here. And it's not just only your direct trade partner, but also these indirect trade partners that will be important. And that means that the trade liberalization agenda should be even more than before, really multilaterally here to capture all the direct and indirect effects of that. It's not just only of trade barriers, it is of course also product standards and uniform product standards, so single market is again important. Uniform or at least aligned product standards will be important for being able for component suppliers to participate much more smoothly in these value chains here. And of course the connection needs to be sufficiently economic, so that means that we also need global production networks and efficient logistic chains here. So that means really infrastructure and complementary services that are sufficiently integrated to allow for low-cost integration here. So that's all to make sure that we have these value chains, global or European here, so that we have an efficient value creation. But of course what matters is then how much value can you capture from that value that is created in these chains here. So which firms, which countries will actually be able to capture the value. And here, as already stressed before, it's very important that capturing value can only be done if you have unique capacities and sustainable capacities within the value chain that allows you to capture value here. So that really ties, again, value chains to innovative capabilities, because they are really a source of sustainable, unique capacities that allow for not just value creation, but also value capture by companies and regions and firms here. So that means for firms, and that means for the policy target, it's not just important to make sure that you have well-functioning value chains and trade policies, but that you also at the same time have a sufficient strong industrial policy that allows for innovative capacities behind the border to capture the value from these value chains here. So really tying trade policy very closely to industrial policy. So that means that overall the target of the policy should be making Europe an attractive place for productive firms with unique innovative capabilities in efficient European value chains, provide the framework conditions for this. Very important also is that it's very hard to know where these efficient value chains and where these innovative capabilities can arise. That can be in any sector, in any type of activity, in any value chain. So that's why it's very important to have a sufficiently horizontal policy here. But and then finally, so combination of trade policy with extra EU, and that's more than just with the UK after Brexit here, but it will actually be multilaterally. We really need to make sure we are sufficiently open extra EU. But in terms of industrial policy, intra-EU should really be focusing on framework conditions for innovation. As I already said before, that's a horizontal policy agenda, but nevertheless I think it's very important to monitor very pivotal sectors for innovation-based growth, where Europe really has the capacity to develop sustainable, innovative positions to capture value. A number of those will definitely include the digital sector, because digital innovations is really a very important driver for innovation-based growth. But also, in view of the strength of Europe, also the biopharma sector is one where, with the application of digital technologies, this could be a very important driver for innovation-based growth in value chains. The transport sector, cars, is definitely an important sector, also including aerospace and space, which is what we will be discussing in more detail here. So although what's important for the EU industrial policy post-Brexit to have a horizontal policy agenda, I think it's also very important to monitor particularly these sectors which can be really very pivotal, to see to which extent all the framework conditions are applying for these sectors here, and whether there are particular policy interventions needed to redress these potential barriers here. So that's a bit in an overview, very short overview, industrial policy challenges, but now I would like to give the floor to
Thank you very much for your remarks. Now, next in line is Ms. Luisa Santos, Director for International Relations at Business Europe and Chair of Business Europe's Brexit Task Force. And Mrs. Santos was a member of the TTIP Advisory Group and is now a member of the Expert Group on EU Trade Agreements. Please, Mrs. Santos, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Well, I am a trade expert, and I was saying this is, I think, the first time that I come to this committee to talk about Brexit. And I will first give an overview of what is Business Europe's position on Brexit, what are our priorities right now, and then going a bit more in detail on what are the cross-sectoral issues that might have an impact for business, for industry, some of them, of course, for services, because for us, industry and services are connected these days. We should not separate them. And then lastly, I will I will summarize what we have done on Brexit and the publications we have done. So what are our priorities right now? Well, you all know that we are living in a very difficult environment. You saw the results of the Salzburg summit. And you also seen that we are in a dramatic, I would say a dramatic moment for Brexit. For us, for business, the key is that we have a transition, meaning that until we have a new agreement that will set a framework for future EU-UK relation, we need to allow for a smooth phasing out from the United Kingdom being part of the EU to the United Kingdom being a third country. And this is the transition where the UK stays in a situation similar to what we have today, so being in the single market and the customs union, but this is condition to the withdrawal agreement. Without the withdrawal agreement, we will not have this transition that is key for business and that we fought a lot for, both in the EU and UK. So, for us, it is important right now, with time going by very fast, and we have until basically October, maybe middle November, to find a solution for the withdrawal, and in particular to find a solution for the question of Ireland. And this for business is important because otherwise we will not have the transition. Now, I would like also to say that in terms of future, and we know that we will need to wait for the UK being a third country to start effectively the negotiations, but for the European business, it's very important that we maintain a close relation with the UK going forward. That's very important. But, and this is an important caveat, we must not put in jeopardy the integrity of the single market. For us, this is key. And of course, meaning that market access, if the UK wants to have further market access to the access, improve market access after leaving the EU, this is conditioned to the fact that it will have less control, for instance, on its trade policy. In the current context, the UK said, or the UK government has said, that they would not like to stay in the single market. They would not like to have a customs union with the EU, and this, of course, is a choice done by the UK government, but on the other hand, it cannot have the same access to the market that it has today. I think that it's important to make this point here because the European business is very keen to maintain the European single market. This is a priority for us. Now, going to the issues that are important in terms of Brexit. I will bring 4 issues that are, I would say, affecting a number of industrial sectors. The first one is, of course, customs. You know that for the moment, and that's the basis of the European Union, we have a common external tariff, meaning we have a common border, we apply the same duties, we apply the same rules in terms of trade with our partners. We also have a common regulatory framework. This is the basis of the internal market. Common rules, same social standards, same environmental standards, same competition, state-head policies. This also means that, of course, you only need to test one product once. You are, in principle, complying with the rules if you are manufacturing in the European Union. Now, with UK out, all of this is put into question. This means that afterwards, we don't know what will happen with the duties. If we, in principle, will have a free trade agreement, the UK will maintain duty-free access to the EU and vice versa, but this is for the moment not guaranteed. And I recall that in sectors like agriculture, for instance, we have very high duties in the EU, sometimes 40%, even further, but also for industrial goods. For instance, for textiles, we have 12% for third countries. We have 10% for automotive. You know, this is one of the requests from the US saying that they have lower duties for cars than we do. So if we don't manage to find a free trade agreement afterwards and agree on duties, we will have, our companies will be faced with additional duties going to the UK and vice versa. Then, of course, as I said, we are assuming that we have the same regulatory framework in the EU and UK. This means that if companies are following the same rules, you only need to test your products once. You only need to label your products with one label. But if the UK does not find an agreement with you, or if the UK decides to diverge on the regulatory space, this means, of course, that we might have 2 tests, we might have different labels, and of course, companies would also need to comply with different rules. And this is additional administrative burden for companies, especially SMEs. They will probably need to hire more people to take care of customs paperwork, and this is very important. But on top of it, it will mean that we'll have border checks. Just think about food. You know that we have very high standards, sanitary and phytosanitary measures. And of course, every product that comes from a third country is, in principle, to make sure it complies with EU rules, we need to check it. And there's additional paperwork that comes with those exchanges. So we can expect, if we don't have an agreement, we can expect significant, and I think the previous speaker already mentioned the question of supply chains, that we have very integrated supply chains between Europe and UK. We have a number of products that are going in and out because of these supply chains. If we introduce customs paperwork, if we introduce additional testing, additional checks, then of course this will increase the costs, and not only that, it will increase the number of operations that will happen at the border. The other point I would bring is rules of origin. This is something that people don't like it a lot, it's not very attractive, but it's a condition to benefit from duty-free. You need to comply with rules of origin, meaning you need to have sufficient production in the preferential area to make sure that your product benefits from duty-free. For instance, for cars right now, you need to have 55% of value added in the preferential area, meaning in the EU and the UK, so that the product can benefit from duty-free. And this is a problem because today you have a lot of inputs coming from different places. So will, afterwards, products manufactured in the EU or the UK will be continued to be considered as being sufficiently produced in the area to benefit from duty-free. So even if we have an agreement, a free trade agreement on the future, it's not guaranteed that we will keep the same supply chains as we have today, because sometimes we might not comply with the rules that are needed to make sure that we have this preferential treatment. And I have to bring here a very important case as well, is that the EU has a number of free trade agreements with third countries, for instance with Korea, with Canada, and we are using inputs from these countries as well. If the UK in the future does not have the same rules as the EU, if the UK does not roll back the agreements that the EU has with these countries, we might not be able, for instance, as EU industry, to use intermediary products from the UK any longer. So this is also an aspect that will have an impact on the supply chains. Now, the regulatory divergence is, of course, the big issue, and is not just an issue for sectors. It's also a more horizontal issue, because when we're talking about competition, when we're talking about social or environmental standards, it's also a question of level playing field. Will the UK maintain the same level playing field, or we will have a problem going forward for companies in the EU and UK to compete? Data flows. It's again an area that impacts a number of sectors. You know that we have the GDPR. Of course, for the moment, the UK is part of the EU, so it has the same rules as the EU. But the moment the UK is a third country, you know that will, under the EU rules, will become non-compliant, meaning that we will need to have an adequacy decision to make sure that we continue to exchange data between the EU and the UK. This could take longer. It could take some time to get this adequacy decision, and this will create, of course, in the meantime, uncertainty for operators. I will not go too much on research and innovation. I think you will have a dedicated workshop on this, but it's definitely one of the areas where we would like to keep a close relation between the EU and UK. These are two publications that we've done on Brexit, because we want companies to be prepared. This is very important, is to make sure that in the meantime, even if we don't know what is going to be the future relation between the EU and UK, that companies prepare for the worst case scenario if this happens, but also that companies have a conscience of what could be the impact on Brexit along the supply chains. And I think this is the most challenging part, especially for SMEs. So we've been, part of our objective as Business Europe is also to raise awareness in companies of the need that they have to be prepared by pointing out the different areas where we might have an impact on Brexit. So thank you. This is it.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Santos. And next is Mr. Jean-Jacques Tortora, serving as Director of the European Space Policy Institute since June 2016. And prior to that, I understand you were Secretary General of ASD Eurospace, which is the trade association of the European space industry. And from 2004 to 2007, you were head of the French Space Agency office in North America, and the attaché for space and aeronautics at the Embassy of France in Washington, D.C. Please, Mr. Tortora, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. It's always a great honor for me to be invited in the European Parliament to, I would say, to elaborate a bit on space policy. Just a few words about the European Space Policy Institute, which is based in Vienna, and it's actually one of its kind, so the unique European think tank, 100% dedicated to space policy-related issues and reflections. UK and space. I will maybe start with a few general overall description of what are the specificities of UK in the space sector. So first, to remind that UK is member of a number of intergovernmental organizations like the European Space Agency, EUMETSAT, and some others, and this will remain so even after the Brexit. I would also highlight how much UK is traditionally focused on business and applications, and probably much more than any other European member states at the moment. And one of the consequences of that is that it has a limited participation in Ariane or in human spaceflight, which are not dealing or in line with their say strategic vision of what the UK industry should do in the space sector. I would also highlight that UK is a member which is very sensitive to security and defense-related issues. So they have been a strong contributor to the reflections in this domain, and I would say that probably the Brexit, or considering the perspective of UK leaving the EU circle of reflection on these issues, might have some implications. And also, last but not least, this is also UK is by far the European member states having the most liberal approach to space. And for those who are not fully convinced of that, I was just picked up a chart that is in one of our SP studies to be issued in the next few weeks about the entrepreneurship. And this is here I show the number of the distribution of the private investment in the space sector, and more particularly in the framework of the so-called new space. And what we see here is that by far UK is the place where most of these activities are taking place. 1/3 of the total throughout Europe have been initiated in UK. So this tells a lot about how UK is not a member like the others. I will come back to that in my conclusion, but before that, maybe I will review what might be the potential consequences on the UK leaving the EU in the various flagship programs of space flagship programs of the EU. I will start first with Copernicus. Just reminding that UK will most likely continue its membership in ESA, EUMETSAT, or ECMWF for climate monitoring, Mercator for maritime observation. And this will grant them access to, I would say, a large set of data. But also the Copernicus is also based on free data policy, which will also ensure the availability of most of them to the UK. So some data might still be restricted to contributing parties. There might be some potential issues for high bandwidth access to the data, but and in the end, what is, I would say, much at stake is the possibility for the UK industry to continue participating in the Copernicus program in the future. So either through the contracts to be issued directly by the EU through the Commission, or in all the processes using EU procurement rules. And of course, what I have in mind is particularly what's going on in the framework of the European Space Agency. But Copernicus is fundamentally a cooperative or collaborative program, and I have really no doubt that it will be in the interest of all parties to continue and to ensure a basis of participation as broad as possible. So I would say the larger the basis is, and the better for the program. So I would expect here some agreements to ensure a harmonious and fine and fair participation of UK in the future. But this is my best guess or my best assumption at this point in time. Next is space security. And of course, what is at stake here is the potential participation of UK in the SST, so Space Surveillance and Tracking, or SSA, Space Situation Awareness EU programs. So some arrangements are still possible to ensure continued access to data. But in this domain, I would say that I feel limited concerns. First, because this program is in the making, so there is still room for negotiation in the future, and in a, I would say, medium-term perspective. Second, because there are no major UK national assets there, as opposed to France or Germany. UK is not contributing with national assets to these programs. So from the EU27 perspective, I would say the potential impact is limited. Next is the fact that major commercial operators, and what I have in mind is, of course, Inmarsat, based in UK, they have, I would say, elaborated a cooperative framework where they exchange data among themselves on the geostationary orbit for collision avoidance purposes. And in this respect, this will not be impacted by Brexit. And last but not least, in this area, in this domain, there are some services which are available from the United States. So at the moment from the Department of Defense, but there are quite great confidence that such services will continue to be provided commercially in the longer run. So in this matter, I would say that we have few reasons, I would say, to feel concerned. Next is the governmental SATCOMs. So GovSatcoms is one of the programs, the new programs currently proposed by the European Union, and this is this area of SATCOMs, of governmental satellites for communications or for secured communications, is actually the sole area, the unique area where UK has ever implemented a strong national space policy. And they have, along the years, deployed a number of military SATCOMs through the Skynet series. We are now at the Skynet 5, and the Skynet 6 is currently under discussion. In the broader, I would say, perspective of SATCOMs in general, the UK industry is also involved in the open geostationary SATCOMs business. There is no reasons that this will change in the future. This is 100% private and commercial. And for all these reasons, this is not a program which is raising major concerns either. Last but not least comes Galileo. So Galileo, I would just like to remind how much UK was initially fiercely opposed to the program, and when the program was decided, they insisted and they managed to get very strong positions of their industry at the core of the PRS, which is the security-related service. And this is actually the program which is creating I would say the most turmoil at the moment regarding the potential disruption of the UK participation. And the first conclusion, and the major conclusion that I think we should draw from that, is that if we needed something to demonstrate the relevance of the investment in Galileo, I think that all these discussions are really providing us with a lot of arguments, and this is really demonstrating how much this program is of high value. Now, what is clear is that all the civil signals, so including the GNOS, will remain accessible to the UK, no reason that they do not. The access to PRS is another question which needs to be decided upon. And what is at stake is the participation, the industrial participation in future developments. And there we have, I would say, a two-step reflection. One level of reflection is the access to the signal, which I would say it's quite an easy question to address, or easier at least. The most difficult part is the involvement of the UK industry at the very core of the management of the security of the system. So should we give, I would say, such access or not? This is a critical question which needs to be addressed. But for that, I would like to conclude before that on the case for space in Brexit. First of all, to remind or to highlight how much all the implications of the Brexit on the space or European space policy are not commensurate to the actual size of the sector. In economic terms, the sector is pretty small, but there is much more at stake than pure economy. Second, is that, okay, the UK has no major industrial space champion. This is quite clear, but nevertheless, they were able to get 17% of the industrial activities in Galileo. And also this UK space industry is strongly export-oriented. So they are pretty much, I would say, at risk there. So even though ESA and R&T at large, I'm not talking about research, but R&T at large, are not to be affected by the Brexit, the question is to assess whether this will be sufficient to keep the critical mass for the UK industry. Because not having the critical mass will definitely put an end to their competitiveness on the sector. And ESA participation or ESA programs are usually one-shot programs. And the only, I would say, what is the closest to a mass market production is what is taking place in the framework of the EU programs through Galileo and Copernicus. And this is what is likely to provide the critical mass. Then the UK might face some potential issues regarding supply chains, access to critical technologies, and access to talent, most importantly. And finally, I would say that the security and defense space-related issues should be addressed in a consistent manner with what will be decided in the broader, I would say, perspective of security and defense at large. Of course, UK, as I said, contributed to shape the EU policy in this matter, especially in the space sector. And I would say that most likely space might be a precursor in the way UK and EU 27 might continue to collaborate or not in security and defense in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tortora. We're going to open up now the floor for questions from members. And first question is from Mrs. Van Bremt from the SND. Please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I asked for the floor not on behalf of myself, but I promised my good colleague Teresa Griffin to read out her questions and statement because she cannot be here. She has a conference back home, the Labour conference. So if that's okay with you, I'm now going to speak on behalf of Teresa Griffin, who's a Labour colleague. Brexit has not even happened yet, but we are already feeling the impact. And according to the IPPR North report, my region, the North will be twice as badly affected by the Brexit than the South. The government's own internal impact assessment shows a loss to the Northwest economy of 2.5% of the GDP if the UK would choose EEA. 8% if it would choose a Canada-style free trade agreement, and 12% is if there's no deal, if there's a hard Brexit. So the knock-on effects on the UK business and therefore tax intake is disastrous. The single market membership is worth up to 45 billion a year to the UK economy. 3 million jobs are linked to the EU, and 48% of the foreign direct investment comes from the EU. Workers are today already losing their jobs due to the companies downsizing or relocating in response to Brexit. We've all seen that, I think, in the automotive industry. Jaguar Land Rover announced recently that the ongoing uncertainty on the Brexit has led to them temporarily cutting production. And a no-deal Brexit might result in having to move all production to Slovakia, with the potential loss of 40,000 jobs and 250,000 jobs in the supply chain. In the space policy sector, the UK participates in the European Space Agency and its related programs, and if it leaves, the UK will have much less influence, of course, in the direction of the space program, and it will have reduced access to satellites, space technology, and research, and independent research is predicting that the air and spacecraft industry could shrink by 8.1%. And Airbus has said that it will transfer contracts for the satellites and their ground systems from the UK to other EU member states. A no-deal Brexit would force them to reconsider its investments in the UK and in long-term footprint in the country. Airbus employs 14,000 people at 25 sites in the UK, all around, half of them in Wales, and it supports more than 100,000 jobs in the wider supply chain and has more than 4,000 suppliers in the UK. And Mrs. Griffin, it's a plea I can understand or fully, I have to say. How on earth can she explain that to her region, where all these people are in danger of losing their job and the industry is falling back? And that's what she wanted to convey, and if people want to react on that, please do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Van Bremt. So we are going to take a couple of questions, and then the panel will have the opportunity to respond. And next in line is Mr. Dan Nika, please.
Thank you so much, Chair. So I'd like to start by saying that I'm sharing completely the views raised and expressed by our guest speakers today. I don't have a question for you. I have rather a question for the British government. Do they know what is to be the result of this adventure? Do they have the right figures in their mind? I'm the rapporteur of Horizon Europe for the European Parliament. And I've been approached by British universities, by British research institutes. I've been approached by everybody. And the question is, what will happen with our cooperation? Where will be, and what will be our position in the Horizon Europe program? And my answer was, you are a member state. If you decide to leave, then make sure that all terms and conditions, there will be a so-called divorce paper. And last week, I think, I met Mr. Barnier, and I was listening carefully on what he was saying. Basically, he said, 100% what to just express your concerns and your figures and your facts, because they're facts. They're just not utopic scenarios or situation, what will happen in the sci-fi literature. So for me, it's only one question, if you are aware. You said that the British industry will be affected. The people, they will be affected. The British trade will be affected. They are aware in the UK about the situation, all these representatives, the UK citizens basically, they are aware about the consequences. Because we are speaking here in Brussels. It's live web stream, but we don't know how many UK people they are watching us. Do they know what will be the outcome in 6 months' time of the Brexit? What will happen after the deadline? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Nika. And finally, Mr. Toshanovsky. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I will speak in my mother language. Já bych chtěl...
Good afternoon. I would like to thank you for this very detailed description of individual projects and issues Brexit could create for these programs. I believe that the Copernicus program can be addressed quite simply, as was indicated, on the basis of trade agreement. But my question regards the Galileo program. I do not see a problem regarding PRS. This could be done on the basis of trade agreements, but the project Galileo as such, as part of security systems, has been developed extremely, and I think it would be very unfortunate if the UK became all of a sudden the third country. It is a very important country for this European project. And my question is, do you see a smart and a reasonable way how to proceed in a manner that the UK would not become a third country, but would remain involved in Galileo? Because Galileo, as it's being now implemented, it turns out it is going to be a very successful program, and I see it as a serious obstacle if we are not able to resolve this situation for this very expensive program. Do you see a way?
Mr. Toshinovsky, and now I'll return to the panel to wrap it up in a very few short minutes. Please, would you start out, Mrs. Veugelers?
Yeah. So very shortly, unfortunately, because this is really a very important issue. Indeed, it was mentioned by Mr. Nika and also by Mrs. Van Bremt. There has been a lot of studies to try to identify what the loss to the UK would be from exiting. And of course it depends very much on what the scenario will be in terms of the trade policies that we will still have with them. But of course what will also matter to a large extent is what kind of behind the border industrial policy the UK will actually set up here. And also on that there is still quite a lot of uncertainty here. So that uncertainty both on the trade policy scenario as well as on the UK industrial policy that it is developing is definitely adding to the extra cost on that. But of course what matters today here is what implications we have for the EU 27 in terms of industrial policy here. And the loss of the UK is not a gain for the EU 27 here in contrast. So we will also be losing from that. Unfortunately, there are way less studies on the negative impact for the EU 27. But again, it's the same effect of uncertainty that we have on what the trade relationship will be and what industrial policy will be of the UK. That will also hurt the EU 27 industrial policy. So I think here, in this respect, what we can do as EU 27 is try to at least be very explicit in terms of what kind of policy we would actually like to have post-Brexit here. And there, I think, in view of the importance of these value chains and interconnectedness, I think it's very important to have a commitment to a multilateral open trade policy here, but with a strong emphasis on making sure we capture value from that, from really focusing on an industrial policy that's based on trying to invest in that innovative capacity building here, which will allow us to really capture the value from value chains and to much better respond to any kind of uncertainty that happens along the value chain. So it's really a call for making sure that within the EU we stick to multilateral open policies, trade policies here, but at the same time also invest even more aggressively in an industrial policy that all goes for innovation-based growth.
Thank you very much. And Mrs. Santos, please.
Well, concerning if people in the UK are aware or not, I think the business community is. Of course, we That's why we are reaching out as well. Sometimes SMEs are not fully aware, because some of them, you have to think about, some of them don't even know their products will end up in UK. So what we are asking, and this has been part of our action as Business Europe, is to make sure that everyone really tracks their own supply chains and understand that sometimes their products end up in the UK market, even if they are supplying German manufacturers or French manufacturers. So that's definitely part of also, not only in the UK, but in Europe, that we need to be quite aware. I will have to make one important point here, because a trade agreement is quite limited in what it can deliver. I mean, normally a trade agreement doesn't address innovation or innovation projects. So don't expect a trade agreement to deal with this. Now, what we are thinking, I think, is with the UK, we need to go further than a normal free trade agreement. But as I explained in the initial part, it needs to be a whole set. It's not just a trade part. If the UK wants to have access or continues to have access to Horizon Europe or Copernicus or other projects, we also need to make sure that we have the same set of rules, that the UK respects the same rules that we are respecting in Europe, because otherwise we will not have a level playing field between our companies, and this is very important. We want, of course, to maintain a close cooperation with the UK, but it very much depends also on the UK and the UK government being decided to respect the same rules and abide to the same obligations as European stakeholders are. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Santos. And finally, Mr. Tortora, please.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, I would say that with the Brexit, UK will, the mechanic or the mechanical consequence of Brexit is that UK becomes a third party, which doesn't mean that we should not remain good friends. Now, this is what I suggested through through the various and multiple agreements that could be envisaged to ensure a good continuity of the UK participation in a number of EU space-related programs. The only critical issue is, as you rightly pointed out, the PRS, because PRS has been designed as a sovereignty development. And actually, when we have good friends, you can still invite them at home, but the question is whether you should give them the keys of your house or not. And this is actually the political decision that we need to make about it. Thank you.
And this wraps it up. A big thank you to all our speakers. Thanks for being with us here today, and thanks for your very interesting presentations, and thanks to the members for their discussion.